They tore off their eyebrows to look worthy. No one told them the pain would become tradition, or that a woman's face could be rewritten until she no longer recognized herself. Beauty was praised, but identity thinned with every stroke of the blade. And the more they erased, the more the world applauded. Tonight, we step into that silence and see what was truly taken from them. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand quietly at the edge of a Tudor court gathering, the first thing that would draw the eye would not be the gowns or the jewels, but the faces. Broad, pale foreheads rising above nearly invisible eyebrows. It would seem as though every woman present had agreed upon a single expression, a single way to shape herself for the gaze of the court. The look carried an air of calm intelligence, a softness that came not from nature, but from countless small acts of alteration. This appearance was not a mere accident, nor a whim. It came from above, from the queens and noblewomen whose portraits hung in chambers and halls, quietly dictating what beauty should resemble. Those portraits, painted with meticulous intention, gave the impression of serenity and purity, and the women who lived beneath them understood that to be favoured, they had to reflect the same image. At the heart of this standard stood the belief that a high, open forehead was a sign of intelligence. A woman who appeared thoughtful could be trusted, and a woman who appeared pure could be accepted within circles of influence. The court valued these visual cues as though they revealed the truth of a person's character. The absence of eyebrows softened the gaze, shortening the distance between the eyes and the hairline until the face resembled the idealized figures found in medieval devotional art. Holy women in manuscripts often looked untouched by the burdens of earthly life, with smooth foreheads that seemed to stretch upward like a quiet offering to heaven. Tudor beauty borrowed directly from this theology, presenting an image of femininity that was both modest and spiritually elevated. The queens themselves became silent instructors in this transformation. Their portraits spread through the kingdom and shaped the expectations of countless women who would never stand near the royal court. When a queen wore the look, the nobility followed. When the nobility followed, everyone else tried not to fall behind. The face became a landscape of social alignment. Women learned to see their natural eyebrows not as harmless features, but as obstacles to refinement. The presence of visible brow hairs suggested an untamed nature, something that had not been disciplined into the courtly ideal. And in a world where appearances often outweighed personal truth, a single feature could determine whether a woman was seen as elegant or lacking. This pressure did not announce itself loudly. It worked in the background, woven into the gestures of women preparing for public life. A lady-in-waiting brushing powder across her forehead would glance at her reflection and notice if her brows broke the smoothness. A noblewoman preparing to attend a feast would catch sight of herself in polished metal and wonder whether her forehead still matched the fashion of those above her. The court was a place where scrutiny lived in every corner, and women learned early that to appear thoughtful and composed, their faces had to be edited into that state. Beauty was not a private matter, it was a public responsibility. The features they chose to display, or erase, reflected their understanding of the roles assigned to them. Influence seeped outward through images rather than words. The painters who created royal portraits had long been shaped by the religious art that preceded them. Their brushes softened faces according to spiritual ideals. Eyes lowered gently. Brows faded to pale shadows. Foreheads widened into fields of quietness. Those conventions moved from altars to court walls, and from court walls to the faces of living women. The connection between holiness and smoothness seemed natural to Tudor minds. A woman who looked like a saint appeared more virtuous, more loyal. more trustworthy. And so, through imitation, the divine slowly entered everyday grooming rituals. Yet behind the elegance was a subtler truth. This standard did not arise from universal admiration, but from the desires and insecurities of those who held power. When a queen preferred a certain look, the rest of the court adapted, not out of devotion but out of necessity. To fall out of step with royal taste meant to risk being overlooked or judged. Beauty became not just an ornament, but a signal of obedience. Each erased brow, each widened forehead, was a quiet declaration of alignment with the expectations of the throne. In this sense, the face became political long before it became decorative. The women who lived under these expectations rarely questioned them. Children saw their mothers preparing their faces for court, their brows thinned or removed, their foreheads dusted pale. Girls grew up assuming that this was what a respectable woman should look like. The standard settled into daily life the way weather does. Constant, accepted, and unexamined. Even those who found the look uncomfortable or unnatural rarely resisted. Resistance risked attention, and attention risked criticism, an outcome far heavier than the discomfort of reshaping one's own features. To walk into a Tudor hall filled with women bearing identical high foreheads was to witness a form of silent coordination. They did not speak of the effort it required, nor of the hours spent adjusting their appearance to match a portrait's instruction. Their conformity created a sense of order, a visual harmony that made them appear almost interchangeable. It is unsettling in hindsight. This transformation of individuality into a surface designed for approval. But in their world, where portraits echoed the authority of the monarch and religious art framed the ideals of purity, it was simply the way things were done. This quiet expectation shaped every decision a woman made about her face. It guided her hand as she prepared to be seen, and it whispered that beauty was not merely appearance, but duty. Yet the face was only the beginning. For once the forehead became a canvas of obedience, other features soon demanded the same treatment, and what those women endured to maintain that illusion reveals a cost far deeper than the skin. A high forehead in Tudor society carried a meaning that reached far beyond appearance, settling quietly into the hierarchy of judgment that shaped a woman's place in the world. It was treated not as a natural feature, but as a sign, an indication of calm intelligence, measured thought, and the quiet discipline expected among those who lived near power. A broad, open forehead suggested clarity of mind, a certain steadiness that the court admired but rarely articulated directly. Women understood this without needing the idea spoken aloud. They saw how often praise lingered on those whose features matched the ideal, and how quickly others were overlooked. The association between a wide forehead and intelligence had roots in older traditions. Medieval scholars and churchmen once interpreted the shape of the head as a reflection of inner virtue, and these thoughts filtered into the visual culture that Tudor people inherited. Paintings of holy women presented faces washed clean of strong lines, with foreheads dominating the composition. The effect was serene, and for those who grew up seeing these images in churches and homes, the message felt almost instinctive. Wisdom had a certain look, and that look began above the eyes. Tudor society did not question the logic. It simply allowed the idea to settle, shaping expectations in a way that seemed gentle on the surface and restrictive underneath. Within noble families, these beliefs took on practical importance. A daughter whose forehead fit the ideal was assumed to possess qualities that made her suitable for courtly service or advantageous marriage. Whether she actually held such traits mattered far less than whether she appeared as though she did. A smooth brow, a clear expanse rising toward the hairline. These became quiet assurances to potential suitors or patrons. Her face communicated promise before she spoke a single word. The suggestion of intelligence became more valuable than intelligence itself, and women learned that their features carried weight in negotiations far beyond their control. Mothers reinforced the standard with deliberate care, teaching their daughters how a proper forehead should look. They adjusted hairlines, applied powders, and refined the surface of the skin until it matched the expectations of the world around them. Girls who watched these rituals grew into women who continued them without hesitation, shaping themselves each morning into versions of the ideal they had absorbed since childhood. The forehead became symbolic not only of intelligence, but of preparation, obedience, and readiness to fulfill the roles assigned to them. At court, the meaning deepened. A woman who appeared thoughtful was easier to trust. A woman who looked composed was assumed to possess moral steadiness. A high forehead created these impressions with little effort. The shape softened the eyes, lifted the face, and conveyed the impression of elevated thoughtfulness, whether real or imagined. Those who lacked the natural form worked quietly to recreate it, for the consequences of appearing unsuitable could close doors before they were ever opened. Many discovered that survival within such a world depended as much on appearance as on character. The phrase "heaven-granted forehead" became a common compliment, reflecting the belief that beauty and virtue shared a divine origin. It was meant to flatter. Yet beneath the softness of the words lay a sharper implication. Those without this feature were somehow less touched by grace. Women felt this judgment, not in arguments, but in silence. The way conversations shifted, the way eyes drifted past them, the way praise gathered around others more readily. A forehead was no longer simply part of the body. It was a quiet test that determined how a woman would be received. This symbolic weight made the forehead into a kind of promise, a surface onto which society projected its expectations of purity and discipline. A woman who maintained the ideal appeared more capable of loyalty, more suited to the structured life of the court, more deserving of consideration in the delicate web of alliances and obligations. Whether these assumptions held any truth mattered little. The illusion alone was powerful enough to influence the course of her life. The more one examines this belief, the more unsettling its logic becomes. A single feature, shaped by tradition rather than nature, determined so much of how a woman was valued or dismissed. The forehead became a stage on which her worth was quietly performed, long before her thoughts or actions had the chance to speak for her. Such expectations revealed how deeply appearance guided judgment in Tudor life, shaping a woman's fate before she ever opened her mouth. And when the forehead gained this symbolic power, attention shifted to the elements that threatened its smooth perfection. What women did to erase those elements exposed a far more painful story beneath the surface. Eyebrows in Tudor society were not treated as simple features of the face. They were read as hints of something base, something tied too closely to the instincts people believed women should rise above. A visible brow, especially one with noticeable texture or shape, was quietly associated with impulsiveness, wildness, and the unrefined parts of human nature. Women who carried such features did not need to be reprimanded openly. The judgment appeared instead in glances, in pauses during conversation, and in the soft way people compared them to those whose faces looked smoother, calmer, more aligned with courtly ideals. To the Tudor mind, refinement required distance from anything that resembled the animal world, and eyebrows, unfortunately, were seen as a reminder of it. The ideal face was expected to appear as though it had been lifted out of earthly concerns, untouched by emotion or instinct. The unbroken forehead was valued not only for its aesthetic, but for the suggestion that whatever thoughts lived beneath it were measured and protected from the disorder of the body. Eyebrows disturbed that illusion. They framed the eyes too sharply, adding expressions that could not be controlled by etiquette or duty. A single raised brow could suggest skepticism. A furrowed pair could reveal worry or disapproval. The court preferred faces that revealed nothing unless deliberately shaped to do so. To achieve that stillness, the brows had to disappear. This preference drew heavily from religious art, where holy figures were portrayed with faces that glowed softly, free from the shadows cast by hair or strong lines. The absence of brows in such images was never questioned. It was simply part of what sanctity looked like. Tudor women grew up seeing these portrayals in chapels and family manuscripts, absorbing them long before they entered adulthood. When they encountered similar faces at court, polished and elevated, the connection felt natural. To be admired, one had to seem distant from the ordinary world, as though shaped by a gentler, untouched plane of existence. That comparison created a quiet but powerful pressure. Women felt the need to refine themselves into something closer to the heavenly figures they saw in paintings. Figures who never revealed impulse or tension. Eyebrows, with their stubborn presence, threatened the serenity of the face, and therefore had to be smoothed away. Removing them was not only an act of grooming, but a symbolic step toward an appearance that aligned with the idealized purity admired by the court. It was a transformation that asked women to hide part of their humanity to be valued. Those who complied found themselves praised for their composure, their gentleness, their elevated appearance. The compliments, though subtle, reinforced the belief that the closer one resembled these serene images, the more one was embraced by society. Even women who privately disliked the look found themselves moving toward it, pulled by the same quiet force that shaped so many other expectations of their lives. To appear too natural was to appear too close to instinct. And instinct was a trait the court wanted nowhere near its carefully cultivated spaces. The logic behind this standard was rarely spoken aloud. Instead, it lived in the habits of the people, in the rituals performed before mirrors each morning, and in the dread women felt when their natural brows started to grow back. They feared that the smallest shadow above the eyes would suggest something undesirable, untamed thoughts, sharp reactions, or emotions that could not be softened by etiquette. These fears were not exaggerated. They were learned from observing the treatment of others. A woman whose brows were visible could become the subject of quiet dismissal, her face considered less graceful, less angelic, less worthy of admiration. The pressure reached even those who did not belong to the upper ranks of courtly life. Noble women, servants, and young girls all absorbed the same message. The ideal face should seem almost untouched by the body's natural tendencies. They watched this ideal, performed by those above them. And with time, they learned to reproduce it, whether done out of genuine belief or out of a desire to avoid scrutiny. The effect was the same. Eyebrows faded from the Tudor idea of beauty until their absence felt normal. The more one considers this expectation, the more unsettling its implications become. Women were asked to erase a part of themselves that revealed emotion, instinct, and individuality. The absence of brows produced a mask-like stillness, a face closer to art than to life. In chasing this ideal, they moved closer to a state that seemed almost otherworldly, as though the most admired women were those who appeared least connected to their own human nature. This quiet transformation reflected how deeply Tudor society valued an appearance that denied the realities of the body. And once the brows were erased in pursuit of purity, women turned to harsher methods to complete the illusion expected of them. The method they embraced, and the silent cost tied to it, reveals far more about their world than any portrait ever allowed to be seen. Removing the eyebrows in Tudor society was not treated as a small adjustment, but as a necessary act in shaping a face that met the expectations of the court. Women approached the task with a quiet determination, knowing that their natural brows, no matter how thin or delicate, interrupted the smooth, unbroken surface that symbolized refinement. The tools they used were simple: razors with uneven edges, metal tweezers that pinched more than they grasped, and wax heated just enough to melt, but rarely enough to spare the skin. Each method required a steadiness of hand and a tolerance for discomfort that women learned through repetition rather than instruction. The process began with removing the obvious hairs, but it rarely ended there. A woman determined to achieve the ideal would continue working past the brow line, lifting the razor or tweezers into the hairline itself. The goal was not merely absence, but expansion. creating a forehead that stretched higher than nature intended. The thin margin between brow and scalp became a site of negotiation, where beauty demanded that the hair retreat further back each time. Women shaved or plucked small sections repeatedly, knowing that any regrowth would disturb the illusion they worked so carefully to create. Waxing was the most severe approach, a method adopted by those who wanted longer-lasting results or who lacked the patience for daily upkeep. Heated wax was applied directly to the brow, allowed to cool just enough to harden, and then pulled away with a sharp motion that left the skin reddened and sensitive. The area often burned afterward, the sting lingering long into the day. Yet even this discomfort was accepted as part of the routine. The women who practiced it understood that beauty in their world required endurance, and the pain became another quiet ritual of belonging. Once the brows were removed, the skin left behind exposed every mark, shadow, and irritation. This raw surface could not be left as it was. Women covered it with layers of white powder, often made from chalk or lead-based mixtures that clung heavily to the skin. The powder softened the redness, concealed uneven patches, and created the pale brightness that signaled purity and control. The forehead then appeared smooth and untouched, even though the effort behind it was anything but gentle. The powder also had a symbolic effect, erasing proof of the manipulation beneath and presenting a face that seemed naturally serene. The routine became part of daily life. Before attending court or stepping into public view, women inspected the area carefully, searching for signs of darkening or regrowth. A shadow where the brows once had been could call attention to itself in ways they feared. They repeated the removal process whenever necessary, sometimes multiple times a week, ensuring that their appearance never suggested neglect. Even women who disliked the practice found themselves caught in the same cycle, aware that failing to maintain the look would draw scrutiny they could not afford. For young girls, the practice began early. Mothers guided their daughters, teaching them how to position the razor, how to hold the skin taut, how to lay a powder to hide the irritation. Girls who watched these rituals learned that beauty required sacrifice long before they understood why the sacrifices were necessary. Eventually, the removal felt natural to them, an ordinary part of preparing for the world outside. By the time they entered adulthood, the idea of leaving the brows in place seemed careless, even improper. The court rarely acknowledged the labor behind the transformation. A woman with a smooth, pale upper face simply appeared more composed, more suitable, more aligned with the ideals celebrated in royal portraits. The absence of brows was read not as the result of sharp tools and irritations, but as a sign of character, discipline, and elevated taste. What the court admired most was often the product of hidden effort, invisible beneath powder and silence. The more one considers this practice, the more striking the contradiction becomes. Women erase the brows to appear calm, pure, and untouched by the body's natural impulses, even though the process itself was harsh, invasive, and undeniably physical. Their faces became masks shaped by expectation, revealing nothing of the pain or diligence required to maintain them. This careful removal revealed how far women were willing to go to meet a standard that valued illusion over comfort. And when the act of erasing the brows became routine, it opened the way for a deeper transformation of the entire face. In that deeper transformation waited consequences that reached far beyond anything they had been prepared to endure. Faces without eyebrows did not become a widespread fashion overnight. They ascended gradually, carried upward by the same force that shaped every other aesthetic choice within the Tudor world. The example set by the Queen, when Elizabeth I committed fully to the look of a broad, exposed forehead. Her court followed with quiet obedience. Her portraits displayed an unbroken whiteness rising above the eyes, a smooth surface that seemed to hold light rather than reflect it. The absence of brows softened her expression, giving her an air of calm authority that felt almost otherworldly. Even those who never saw her in person came to understand that this was the face of regal composure, the face of a woman who embodied power through restraint. What began as the Queen's personal preference soon became a silent directive. Noble women understood instantly that their fortunes, invitations, and reputations depended on alignment with the visual language of the court. By adopting the same appearance, they signaled loyalty and sophistication. Servants observed their mistresses preparing for public life and repeated the same gestures. Young girls watched their mothers erase their brows and powder the space, learning that this was not merely beautification, but social survival. The look rippled outward through households, estates, and towns, until it belonged not only to royalty, but to every woman mindful of her place in society. Even those with little connection to the court felt the pull of its imagery. Portraits reproduced the Queen's appearance with unwavering consistency, and these images found their way into homes, guild halls, and public buildings. They became silent teachers, spreading the expectation of the ideal face. Artists played a significant role in solidifying the trend. When they painted noble women or wealthy patrons, they softened the brow area, diminished the presence of hair, and widened the forehead to echo the royal aesthetic. Their choices shaped collective memory, creating a version of womanhood that appeared serene, almost divine, and entirely free of the natural lines and textures that once framed the eyes. Women who looked at these paintings understood the message clearly. Beauty belonged to those who could erase themselves into stillness. If the Queen presented her power through a face rendered quiet and bright, then the path to acceptance, even admiration, required others to follow. In markets, gatherings, and parish walls, the spread of such portraits created a new norm. The look became so deeply woven into daily life that many forgot it had ever been different. The natural brow came to feel out of place, too expressive, too disorderly to belong in a world striving for visual calm. Among townspeople and merchants' wives, imitation took on a slightly different tone. They lacked the resources for skilled painters or expensive cosmetics. Yet they pursued the same ideal with the tools available to them. Their efforts sometimes left the skin red and uneven, but the intention mattered more than the result. Conformity brought a sense of belonging, and belonging brought safety. For many, the new fashion was less about beauty and more about proving awareness of the world above them. A quiet declaration that they were not ignorant of courtly expectations. The transformation of the face into a smooth, browless surface thus became more than a trend. It became a shared performance. Women carried the look into churches, feasts, and daily tasks, reinforcing the aesthetic through constant visibility. No one needed to speak of it. The power of the court's example was enough to ensure its spread. As years passed, the connection between the absence of eyebrows and the appearance of grace grew stronger, until the look felt inseparable from the idea of Tudor womanhood. The trend was not merely copied, it was absorbed. What makes this shift most striking is how quietly it unfolded. Women altered their faces not out of coercion, but out of a deep, learned understanding that acceptance depended on appearing correct. The court, the portraits, and the murmurs of admiration created a standard that few questioned. The browless face became a marker of elegance, so familiar that even those who disliked it obeyed it. In time, the erased brow came to symbolize not only beauty but discipline, evidence that a woman could soften herself into the image demanded of her. This widespread imitation revealed how effortlessly a queen's preference could reshape the faces of an entire society. And once that conformity took hold, the expectations surrounding those altered faces grew sharper and more demanding. Within those expectations lay pressures that would push women into even harsher rituals than the loss of their brows. The polished, browless faces admired in Tudor courts carried a quiet suffering that never appeared in portraits or praise. Each smooth forehead, each pale surface rising cleanly above the eyes, was the result of constant irritation, swelling, and the sting of repeated removal. Women who tried to maintain the ideal learned quickly that the elegance admired by others came at the expense of their own comfort. The tools they used, rough tweezers, blunt razors, wax heated unevenly, left the skin raw and tender. The redness did not fade quickly. It lingered through hours of courtly duties, dinners, and ceremonies, disguised only by thick layers of pale powder. But beneath that powder, the skin pulsed with the memory of each pull, each scrape, each moment of tearing. Every session of plucking or shaving carried the risk of injury. Without modern sanitation, even the smallest break in the skin invited infection. Tweezers were rarely cleaned, razors dulled quickly, and wax was often reused from previous attempts. Women understood the hazards, but continued the ritual anyway. They dabbed at irritated patches with cloths dipped in water that offered no protection, hoping to quiet the redness before they stepped into public view. Sometimes, small cuts formed along the brow ridge, and these cuts, when touched by powder or sweat, burned sharply. Yet few spoke of this discomfort, for acknowledging the pain would mean admitting that beauty came at a cost others preferred not to see. The dangers deepened when the removal extended beyond the brows and into the hairline. Each additional stroke of the razor opened new opportunities for infection. Some women developed swelling that lasted for days, the skin puffing slightly above the eyes until they struggled to keep their lids from drooping. Others found small, painful bumps forming under the surface. The body's attempt to respond to the constant assault. These irritations interrupted their sleep and made simple expressions difficult. But still, they continued. The standard demanded maintenance, and maintenance demanded endurance. Women lived with the knowledge that infection was a constant threat. Stories circulated quietly about those who developed fevers or persistent sores. But such tales were treated as unfortunate accidents rather than warnings. The court valued appearance too highly for these risks to warrant reconsideration. A woman whose face betrayed signs of illness might find herself gossiped about or pitied. Yet few questioned the root of the problem. The pressure to meet the ideal remained untouched. Beauty in Tudor society was a duty, and duty required sacrifice. Even those who suffered the most rarely abandoned the practice. To appear with visible brows or an uneven forehead was to risk subtle exclusion, the kind that shaped invitations, alliances, and standing. Women understood that pain was easier to endure than the consequences of appearing out of step with the world around them. They learned to grit their teeth through the pulling, to hold their breath when the razor caught the skin, to press powder gently over the freshest wounds so the surface appeared unbroken. These small acts, repeated endlessly, became part of daily life. The contradiction was striking. The faces praised for their serene calmness were created through routines that brought anything but calm. Women walked into gatherings with expressions softened by powder and absence. Even as their skin throbbed beneath the surface, their beauty was admired, yet the effort behind it remained unseen. Dismissed as natural when it was anything but, they carried this discomfort silently, accepting it as one more expectation they were required to meet. The more one examines this hidden suffering, the clearer its implications become. The ritual did not simply demand endurance, it demanded silence. Women were expected to show no sign of the pain that shaped their faces, for to speak of it would draw attention to the unnaturalness of the ideal. Their sacrifice became invisible, absorbed into the smooth planes of their foreheads and the faint dusting of powder that masked the truth. Such daily pain revealed how beauty in Tudor life was not admired for its natural form, but for the discipline required to create it. And as the strain of maintaining the ideal deepened, women sought ways to conceal not only their brows, but the marks left behind. In that concealment lay the beginnings of rituals far more elaborate than the court ever acknowledged. Religious influence settled over Tudor beauty standards with a quiet weight, shaping the way women understood their faces long before they stood in front of a mirror. In chapels, monasteries, and household prayer books, holy figures stared back at them. Or saints, angels, and martyrs rendered with serene, unbroken foreheads and faces untouched by the ordinary marks of humanity. These figures appeared distant, softened by pale tones and smoothed contours, their brows either faint suggestions or absent entirely. To those who saw them daily, the connection between holiness and a browless face became so familiar that it felt unquestionable. A woman who hoped to appear virtuous absorbed these images without realizing how deeply they guided her. The church never issued formal commands about eyebrows, but its visual language communicated far more effectively than words. The idealized faces in paintings and illuminated manuscripts presented a beauty that seemed lifted out of the earthly world, as though the absence of brows signaled a transcendence of emotion, instinct, and imperfection. Parish priests spoke often of purity, of rising above base impulses, of shaping the soul through discipline. Women who listened to these messages learned to read their own features through the same lens. If saints appeared serene because their faces were free of strong lines, then perhaps serenity itself required such a face. This interpretation did not replace religious doctrine, but it colored the way women connected morality to appearance. A calm, pale, unbroken forehead came to symbolize not just beauty, but goodness. A face that revealed nothing. No tension, or no instinct. No lingering trace of the body's natural expression. Felt closer to the holy. The more a woman resembled the images filling her church, the easier it was for her to believe she reflected the virtues praised from the pulpit. In a world where spiritual worth was woven into daily life, this resemblance mattered deeply. Artists continued to reinforce the connection without fully intending to. When they painted noble women, they often borrowed the same visual cues used in religious art: softened brows, widened foreheads, and minimal shadows around the eyes. This approach made their subjects appear composed, elevated, and morally stable. These portraits circulated through homes and courts, blending seamlessly with the religious imagery that inspired them. Women who saw themselves depicted in this style learned to accept the altered version of their appearance as aspirational rather than artificial. Religion also shaped expectations through the way it framed inner virtue. Sermons emphasized humility, restraint, and the quiet regulation of one's emotions. These traits aligned easily with the browless ideal, which muted expression and replaced it with a mask-like calm. A woman who removed her brows thus participated, knowingly or not, in a practice that symbolized her commitment to moral discipline. She was presenting herself as someone who controlled her impulses, someone who was suited to the orderly, reverent environment encouraged by the church. The pressure grew even stronger in communities where religious observance structured daily life. Young girls learned early that beauty was not simply a matter of admiration, but of moral alignment. Mothers pointed to images in books or on church walls, describing the faces of saints as models for purity. Girls grew accustomed to seeing holiness presented without eyebrows, and internalized the idea that their own features might require adjustment to align with that ideal. The removal of the brows became an act of shaping both the body and the self, as though discipline applied to one could influence the other. For many women, the boundary between spiritual expectation and social expectation blurred until the two became indistinguishable. The church encouraged an image of women as calm, gentle, and controlled, qualities visually represented by the browless faces in religious art. Society then enforced this ideal more directly, rewarding those who appeared appropriately serene and quietly judging those who did not. The result was a cycle in which art informed faith, faith informed beauty, and beauty informed behavior. Seen this way, the absence of eyebrows was not simply cosmetic, it was a symbolic gesture, A woman erased the brows to signal that she sought purity, that she resisted the earthly impulses etched naturally on the face. Her smooth forehead became a surface onto which others projected expectations of moral steadiness. Whether she believed these expectations or merely endured them mattered less than the fact that she carried them on her skin. This blending of beauty and faith revealed how powerfully the church shaped the way women interpreted their own bodies. And as spiritual ideals merged with social demands, the pressure to conform tightened around every woman seeking acceptance. Within that tightening lay a judgment that reached far beyond appearance, touching the deepest parts of a woman's daily life. Women whose eyebrows remained visible in Tudor society carried a weight that few would acknowledge directly, but many would feel immediately. A fuller brow drew the eye in ways that unsettled the standards of the time, disrupting the smooth field of the forehead that had become the quiet measure of refinement. Such brows were treated not as harmless features, but as signs of coarseness, suggesting a woman who had not disciplined herself into the softness expected at court. The judgments rarely surfaced in spoken criticism. Instead, they appeared in the brief hesitation before a greeting, the sidelong glance exchanged between onlookers, or the tone of polite conversation that cooled ever so slightly. These moments formed a silent verdict. A woman with unruly brows was lacking in delicacy. The implications ran deeper than simple preference. Visible brows were interpreted as markers of impulsiveness, as though the natural lines above the eyes revealed too much of one's inner life. Women with thicker brows were considered less controlled, less refined, and less suited to environments that valued restraint above sincerity. In gatherings, they sometimes felt attention drift away from them, their presence overshadowed by others whose faces fit the accepted ideal more closely. Even when no one said a word, the atmosphere conveyed the message clearly enough. Beauty was not merely desired but required, and deviation from it carried social consequences. Gossip amplified the pressure. A woman who appeared with brows unplucked became an easy subject for whispers, her appearance treated as a sign of negligence or even moral weakness. Remarks circulated quietly, comments about boldness that bordered on impropriety, or suggestions that she lacked the discipline expected of her station. Such judgments were rarely rooted in truth, but in a society that viewed physical refinement as a reflection of inner character, the appearance became inseparable from reputation. A fuller brow hinted at indulgence, and indulgence was considered unbecoming. These attitudes carried real consequences in social spaces. Invitations to gatherings, dinners, or celebrations sometimes depended on the unspoken expectation that each attendee would reflect well upon the host. A woman whose appearance drew negative attention risked being excluded, not out of cruelty, but out of the court's relentless desire to maintain order and elegance. Exclusion did not always take the form of outright dismissal. Often it emerged in subtler ways. Delayed invitations, polite excuse, or the quiet fading of her presence from certain circles. This fading was more painful than direct rejection, for it left her to question what part of herself had offended. Women internalized these pressures quickly. Even those who initially resisted the fashion found themselves standing before mirrors, studying their brows with a growing sense of unease. They watched other women glide effortlessly through social spaces, their faces softened by absence, their expressions gently controlled. The contrast made their own reflections appear heavier, more marked by the body's natural textures. The thought that others might judge them harshly, judge their discipline, their upbringing, their worth, became difficult to ignore. It was easier to adapt than to withstand the quiet scrutiny that followed them. The fear of being perceived as careless or vulgar led many women to monitor their appearance with increasing vigilance. Small deviations became sources of anxiety, prompting them to search for shadows of regrowth or uneven patches that might invite comment. They learned to evaluate their own faces with the same unforgiving eye the world turned upon them. What began as a social expectation soon grew into a personal habit. Women corrected themselves long before anyone else had the chance to question them. This self-scrutiny shaped their daily routines. Even when alone, the presence of thicker brows felt like a flaw that needed adjustment. Mothers taught their daughters to notice these details early, hoping to shield them from the judgment that awaited those who appeared careless. The daughters, in turn, absorbed the lesson without protest. They understood that maintaining dignity required controlling one's appearance to avoid giving others any reason to doubt one's refinement. The more closely one examines this pressure, the clearer its impact becomes. Women were not merely conforming to a trend, they were protecting their reputations, their opportunities, and their place within a rigid social order. Their eyebrows, small as they were, became symbols of everything society scrutinized: discipline, modesty, and the willingness to conform. To leave them untouched was to risk being misunderstood. And misunderstanding in Tudor society carried consequences that extended far beyond the surface of the skin. These unspoken judgments revealed how fiercely appearance shaped a woman's standing, reaching into the smallest details of her face. And as the pressure mounted, many turned to increasingly strict routines to reshape themselves before anyone else could judge them. In those routines lay a deeper burden, one that transformed grooming into a daily negotiation between fear and expectation. Eyebrow removal in Tudor society did not remain an occasional act performed for special appearances. It evolved into a daily ritual that shaped the rhythm of a woman's life. Among noble households, the process began early in the morning, long before anyone appeared in the halls or entered the presence of higher-ranking figures. Ladies of status rarely carried out the task alone. Their attendants, trained through observation rather than formal instruction, understood how to angle the razor, how to pluck with minimal hesitation, and how to powder the skin afterward so the irritation did not betray itself in public. The intimacy of this work created a quiet bond between mistress and servant. Though neither spoke much during the ritual, the act required concentration, steadiness, and acceptance, three qualities woven deeply into Tudor womanhood. The removal itself became as routine as washing the face or arranging the hair. Women approached it not with vanity, but with obligation, knowing that any regrowth, however small, would disrupt the smooth expanse demanded by the court and its ideals. Before applying cosmetics, before choosing jewelry, before stepping toward the wardrobe, they tended first to the brows. The ritual was repeated with such regularity that it ceased to feel extraordinary. It became part of the environment in which they lived, as natural as the morning light filtering through the shutters or the sound of servants tending to the hearth. The process was quiet but meticulous. Attendants examined the brow ridge closely, searching for the faintest dark patch. Tweezers tugged at stubborn hairs. Razors scraped gently across the upper face. And wax, when used, hardened quickly in the cool air before being pulled away. The skin reddened, tightened, and sometimes swelled. Yet the ritual continued with the same cadence each day. Pain was acknowledged through silence, endured because the alternative invited judgment. The skin was then soothed, or rather, concealed, beneath pale powder. The result was a face that seemed effortless, though effort shaped every inch of it. For public appearances, the timing of the ritual shifted. Women often repeated the process in the afternoon, ensuring that no stray hair had re-emerged under the warmth of the day or the glow of candles. Courts, feasts, and gatherings were places of constant scrutiny, and a face deemed unprepared suggested a lapse in discipline. Even a shadow along the brow ridge could draw attention, and attention brought whispers. Maintaining the illusion of perfect smoothness required vigilance from morning until night. What makes this daily commitment more striking is how early it began. Girls not yet old enough to understand the expectations awaiting them were introduced to the ritual through gentle demonstrations. Mothers or older sisters guided their hands, encouraged them to observe closely, and explained that a high, open forehead was something to be cultivated, not merely inherited. The first plucking was often done for them, accompanied by soft reassurances meant to lessen the sting. Over time, these girls accepted the discomfort as a normal part of becoming presentable. By adolescence, many had already woven the ritual into their own routines. They learned how to hold the skin taut, how to avoid leaving uneven patches, and how to press powder lightly so the surface appeared smooth. They did not question why they must do these things. They only understood that the world expected their faces to align with a particular image. Their acceptance reflected not naivety, but adaptation. In a society where appearance determined opportunity, they learned quickly that discipline began at the brows. Among households without attendants, the ritual unfolded more quietly, but no less seriously. Women worked alone in small rooms, using whatever tools they could afford. Rougher methods meant more pain, but the pressure to conform remained the same. These women, too, shaped their mornings around removal, adjusting their schedules and responsibilities to accommodate the ritual. The act transcended class, binding women together through a shared understanding of what they must endure to be seen correctly. The more one observes this daily practice, the clearer its impact becomes. It shaped not only physical appearance, but also the way women measured their own readiness for the world. A woman who had tended to her brows felt shielded against judgment, one who had not carried a quiet fear of being found wanting. The ritual became a mirror through which Tudor womanhood examined itself, reaffirming expectations that no portrait would ever fully reveal. Such constant repetition showed how grooming transformed into discipline, shaping not only the face, but the pace of each woman's day. And as the ritual settled into the fabric of life, its long-term consequences began to mark the skin in ways that powder could not hide. Within those marks lay the beginning of troubles that no amount of refinement could fully erase. The long-term effects of constant brow removal did not appear immediately. They accumulated slowly, settling into the skin with a persistence that no amount of powder could disguise forever. Women who began the ritual in youth often realized, too late, that the delicate hairs above their eyes no longer returned as they once had. Repeated plucking weakened the follicles until the brows grew back in thin, uneven lines or failed to grow at all. The absence, once a choice made to meet an ideal, became a permanent mark. Some welcomed this result, relieved that they no longer needed to maintain the ritual as often. Others felt a quiet unease, knowing that the damage carried implications they never intended. Their faces, once shaped deliberately, had become landscapes altered beyond correction. The skin around the brow ridge suffered even more. Constant scraping, tugging, and waxing thinned the surface, making it more vulnerable to injury. Each time the razor swept across the upper face, it removed not only the hair, but also layers of protection that the skin relied upon. Women noticed small changes at first. A heightened sensitivity to touch, a warmth that lingered long after the irritation should have faded. Over the years, these sensations deepened into a fragility that made even gentle contact uncomfortable. The area reddened more quickly, bruised with ease, and reacted sharply to cold air or sunlight. Yet the ritual continued, because the standard demanded it. Even as the body signaled its distress, the weakened skin responded in unpredictable ways. Tiny cuts formed where the razor slipped or where tweezers pinched too tightly. These wounds, minor as they seemed, healed imperfectly, leaving faint scars beneath the surface. Powder helped conceal them, but the powder itself, thick, bulky, and made from harsh mixtures, clogged the pores and irritated the already tender area. Over time, small bumps developed, some filled with fluid, others hardened into narrow ridges that sat just below the upper layers of skin. Women pressed powder over these imperfections, the very substance that worsened them, creating a cycle that trapped them between concealment and further injury. The infections that arose from weakened skin posed bigger risks. Without proper cleaning of tools or access to effective treatments, even a mild irritation could develop into something far more serious. Swelling around the eyes sometimes spreads downward, making the eyelids heavy and painful to lift. Fevers followed on occasion, accompanied by headaches that lingered for days. These episodes were rarely attributed to the grooming ritual directly. Illness was common in Tudor life, and few connected the symptoms to the small wounds hidden beneath powder. Yet for many women, the pattern repeated so frequently that it became part of their understanding of the body. A quiet ache they accepted as inevitable. What makes these consequences more striking is how quietly they settled into daily life. Women seldom spoke of the long-term damage, partly out of resignation and partly out of the belief that suffering was simply part of becoming presentable. Even as their brows stopped growing evenly, or their skin thinned to the point of constant tenderness, they continued to remove whatever regrowth remained. To appear with stray hairs was to risk judgment, and judgment carried a weight far heavier than the discomfort they endured in private. Silence, once again, shielded the ritual from scrutiny. The damage shaped not only the present, but the future. Older women, whose brows had long since ceased to grow, bore faces permanently marked by the ideal of their youth. Their foreheads appeared stretched and empty, the absence of hair now unchangeable. Some found relief in no longer needing to maintain the ritual, while others felt estranged from their own reflections. The ideal they had chased in service to beauty had altered them in ways the court never acknowledged. Their faces carried a history of discipline, endurance, and quiet harm that younger women could not yet see. Even the youngest participants paid a price. Girls taught to shape their foreheads early experienced the thinning of the skin long before adulthood. Their brows grew back unevenly, forming patterns that required even more correction. In trying to match the ideal, they created conditions that made maintaining the ideal increasingly difficult. The cycle deepened with each generation, embedding the consequences into their bodies long after fashion itself shifted. The more one observes these lasting effects, the more apparent it becomes that the ritual was not simply a matter of beauty, but of bodily sacrifice. Women altered themselves to meet a standard that promised admiration, yet demanded permanence. Their brows, their skin, their comfort, each became part of a silent exchange between expectation and identity, one that left marks far deeper than the surface suggested. Such enduring damage revealed how thoroughly beauty demanded obedience, reshaping the body long after the ritual ended. And as these marks accumulated, women sought new ways to disguise what the years had carved into their skin. Through those new attempts emerged a transformation that reached further than concealment, touching the very idea of what a face was meant to be. The high foreheads admired throughout Tudor society were rarely gifts of nature. They were crafted through repeated acts of scraping, thinning, and reshaping that transformed the upper face into something far from what it had been. Women learned early that the natural boundaries of their features were not fixed. The hairline, in particular, became a place of quiet negotiation, where beauty demanded space that the body had not originally offered. What appeared effortless in portraits, the broad, pale expanse rising above calm eyes, was the product of work that left the skin tender and the scalp marked by years of alteration. The practice began with subtle reshaping. Women used razors to shave the fine hairs that framed the forehead, expanding the smooth area by small degrees. At first, the change seemed slight, a soft widening that did not disturb the overall balance of the face. But as expectations heightened and comparisons sharpened, women pushed the boundary further. They shaved deeper into the hairline, removing not only stray hairs, but whole sections of growth. The act was not performed with aggression, but with precision. Each stroke of the blade carried out with the same patience used in embroidery or lacework. Yet the effect was stark. With each repetition, the forehead rose higher, The hairline receded further, and the face took on the shape expected of those who wished to appear refined. For many women, the process became a regular task, woven into the same routines that governed brow removal. The tools used for shaping the hairline were often the same. Small razors, dulling quickly from frequent use. Without proper maintenance, these blades tugged at the skin, scraping unevenly and sometimes cutting more deeply than intended. A small wound near the hairline was easy to hide beneath powder, but the discomfort lingered. Women who shaved regularly noticed the skin above their brows growing increasingly fragile, more susceptible to redness or irritation. Yet the desired effect outweighed the inconvenience. A high forehead signaled grace, intelligence, and alignment with the ideals of the court. A lower one hinted at ordinariness, a quality Tudor society had little patience for in women who sought status or security. Some took the practice even further. Instead of simply shaving the hairline, they plucked individual hairs to create a cleaner, sharper boundary. This approach was painstaking, requiring attention to each follicle. The skin at the edge of the scalp reacted harshly, swelling or forming small bumps that women covered with thick powder. Others used cloths to rub the area repeatedly, thinning the hair gradually until it gave way. Repetition created the illusion that the hairline had always been naturally high. Over time, the distinction between what was altered and what was inherited blurred, even for the women themselves. The goal extended beyond removing brows or adjusting the hairline. It sought to create a forehead that resembled the unbroken pale field seen in religious art, a surface rising almost from the nose to the crown, emphasizing purity and mildness. To achieve this, some women shaved so deeply into their hairline that the contrast between forehead and scalp nearly disappeared. Their faces took on a luminous openness that the court admired, even if the process behind it remained unspoken. The look was praised for its elegance, its softness, its suggestion of serenity. No portrait hinted at the soreness beneath the powder or the rawness along the scalp. The ideal face appeared effortless, though it had cost hours of work and layers of discomfort. Girls learned these methods long before their bodies were ready for them. Mothers demonstrated how to shape the hairline, explaining that a refined forehead opened doors and quieted judgment. The first attempts were hesitant, often leaving irregular patches that required careful covering. But with time, the girls learned to smooth the area evenly, to press powder into the tender skin, and to conceal any redness that appeared. They grew up believing that a forehead's height was something one earned, not something one possessed naturally. Their reflections gradually shifted, becoming less like the faces of childhood and more like the faces expected by society. For many women, the transformation became permanent. Hair that had been shaved or plucked for years often failed to grow back uniformly. The scalp adapted to its repeated disruption, causing sparse or uneven regrowth. Some welcomed the permanence, relieved that they no longer needed to manage the area as often. Others felt a quiet sadness when they realized their appearance had been altered beyond reversal. The forehead they carried into old age was shaped by choices made long before they had understood their consequences. The more one considers this ritual, the clearer its significance becomes. The high foreheads admired in Tudor portraits were not simply symbols of beauty, they were records of endurance, discipline, and the silent acceptance of pain. Women reshaped themselves to embody ideals that had little to do with comfort or individuality. The smooth expanse of their foreheads reflected not purity, but persistence, a willingness to meet expectations, no matter how deeply those expectations cut into the skin. Such deliberate reshaping revealed how far women were compelled to go in pursuit of an ideal that denied the body's natural form. And as the forehead grew higher through daily abrasion, the need to mask its marks demanded ever more elaborate methods. Those methods, quietly adopted and seldom questioned, would reshape not only the face, but the meaning of beauty itself. Cosmetics played a central role in completing the transformation of the Tudor face, especially once the brows had been erased, thinned, or shaved away. The removal alone was never enough. The skin left behind was red, uneven, and marked by small cuts or irritated patches. And women needed methods to conceal these signs before stepping into the presence of others. Makeup, therefore, became less an adornment and more a necessity. A final step in reinforcing the illusion of calm purity that portraits celebrated. What seemed serene in paintings was, in daily life, the result of careful layering, mixing, and smoothing. Each step performed with the same discipline as any ritual of grooming. The base of this transformation rested on white cosmetics, mixtures that promised brightness and uniformity but carried their own dangers. One of the most common materials was white lead powder, cherished for its fine texture and unmatched ability to cover imperfections. Women dipped small cloth puffs or fingers into the powder and pressed it into the tender skin above the eyes. The powder clung tightly, hiding redness and discoloration beneath a cold, pâle surface. Another blend involved chalk mixed with vinegar, creating a paste that dried into a smooth, matte layer. These substances offered coverage, but left the skin dry and tight, reinforcing the desire for more powder to soften the appearance. The cycle, once begun, rarely stopped. The area where the brows once grew required special attention. Without hair to break the surface, the skin there reflected light differently, revealing unevenness even under a dim candle glow. Women responded by packing the region with heavier layers of powder than the rest of the face. Pressing too firmly caused the underlying irritation to flare, so the application required a feather-light touch. Yet the amount of product needed to create an unbroken field of whiteness made delicacy difficult. Thick layers settled into small bumps and fine lines, forcing women to blot and reapply until the surface looked stable. What observers saw as flawlessness was, in truth, a surface held together by effort that might not withstand a long evening or a warm room, because an entirely blank upper face appeared unsettling. Many women chose to redraw their brows with tools that created fine, controlled lines. A small piece of blackened charcoal remained the most accessible option, held lightly between the fingers. It could trace an arch that signaled refinement without overpowering the forehead's desired openness. The lines were thin, pale, almost hesitant, a subtle echo of the brows that once lay there. Others preferred mineral pigments, ground into powder and mixed with a bit of oil or water to create a soft, smudge-resistant mark. These pigments offered more stability, but required a trained hand to avoid making the brows too dark or expressive. Anything too bold disrupted the ideal of restraint and calm. The act of drawing these brows varied from woman to woman. Some approached it as an art, shaping an arch that conveyed dignity or mildness. Others repeated the same quick strokes each morning, guided more by habit than creativity. But all shared one quiet understanding. The drawn brow must never appear strong enough to challenge the dominance of the forehead. It existed only to guide the eye gently, not to claim attention. The brows became symbolic, suggesting the idea of a feature rather than the feature itself. Their presence reassured viewers, but their softness reminded them that beauty remained aligned with purity, not assertiveness. The materials used in this process interacted in unpredictable ways. The combination of lead powder and charcoal could turn greasy under heat, causing the brow to blur. Women carried cloths to touch up the area discreetly, retreating for a moment during gatherings to check whether the lines still held. Rain or mist posed particular problems, dissolving the powder and faintly streaking the charcoal. Those who could afford it hired attendants to stand nearby at court functions, ready to dab away sweat or reapply pigment. Others simply endured the uncertainty, hoping that dim lighting would disguise imperfections. The long-term effects of these cosmetics were rarely acknowledged. Lead-based powders damaged the skin, causing it to thin, scar, or discolor over time. Vinegar mixtures stung the freshly shaved area, deepening the irritation. Pigments sometimes triggered infections when applied over small cuts. Yet few women allowed themselves to consider these risks. The need to present a polished, untroubled face outweighed any quiet fear about the harm accumulating beneath the powder. Beauty, in this context, demanded not only discipline but denial of pain, of risk, of the body's natural response to repeated injury. In many ways, makeup served as the final reinforcement of a standard that reshaped the entire upper face. It concealed the marks left by razors, softened the wounds from waxing, and disguised the slight unevenness caused by plucking. The painted brows acted as a reminder of the feature that had been taken away, and then carefully replaced with something more acceptable to the era's ideals. Women created and maintained these illusions daily, knowing they were fragile but necessary. Such careful layering showed how cosmetics completed the transformation, turning altered skin into an image that appeared effortless from afar. And as powders and pigments built the illusion thicker each day, the need for even harsher methods crept into women's routines. Within those harsher methods waited consequences that would shape both their faces and their fates in ways they could not yet foresee. Mistakes in Tudor beauty practices did not arise from carelessness, but from desperation, an unrelenting desire to maintain an appearance that demanded more than the body could safely provide. As the expectations surrounding the brows and forehead intensified, women turned to harsher substances in hopes of achieving smoother skin, finer lines, and a more pristine surface than nature allowed. The most dangerous of these substances appeared deceptively useful. Compounds containing mercury, prized for their ability to strip hair quickly and whiten the skin with startling efficiency. In a world that judged women on the refinement of their faces, the promise of such immediate results proved irresistible, even if the risks were not fully understood. Mercury-based ointments were applied to the brow ridge with the same careful touch used for powders and pigments. At first, the results seemed miraculous. The remaining hairs dissolved or fell out with minimal effort, leaving behind an unnaturally smooth surface. Women who had struggled with uneven regrowth or small, stubborn patches embraced these treatments as answers to their frustrations. They saw not the poison but the perfection it offered. The whiteness left behind resembled the pale glow celebrated in portraits, reinforcing the illusion that the product elevated their appearance rather than eroding their safety. The earliest signs of danger were subtle, a faint burning sensation, a tightness beneath the skin, a headache that lingered longer than usual. These warnings were often dismissed. Beauty in Tudor society demanded endurance, and discomfort was expected. But the reactions grew harsher with repeated use. The skin around the brows began to swell, forming red patches that no amount of powder could fully hide. Blisters emerged along the hairline, small at first, then larger, filled with fluid that dried into cracked layers. Women soon found themselves caught in a cycle where the treatments caused damage, and the damage encouraged more treatment to conceal the evidence. The very substance meant to refine their appearance instead carved deeper marks into their faces. Infections followed easily. The shaved brow ridge, already vulnerable from years of grooming, became an open gateway for illness. Mercury weakened the skin further, destroying its natural defenses. Even minor cuts from razors or tweezers, which might once have healed quietly, now festered beneath layers of powder. Fever set in quickly for some, while others saw the swelling spread toward their eyes. The proximity of these wounds to the eyes posed risks that few anticipated. There were cases where the inflammation damaged vision permanently. Women accustomed to managing ritual discomfort suddenly found themselves confronting dangers they could neither predict nor control. Among the most tragic outcomes were the transformations that time refused to soften. Once the skin scarred deeply, The face settled into shapes that could not be concealed. The smooth, open forehead that Tudor fashion demanded became mottled with irregular patches or darkened by discoloration. Blistered skin healed into raised ridges, forming patterns that disrupted the symmetry so prized in courtly settings. Women who had once been considered refined lost the very attributes they had worked to preserve. Their mirrors reflected the cost of choices shaped not by vanity but by the obligation to conform. These changes were not dramatic in a single moment but emerged slowly, silently, and without mercy. What made these consequences even more painful was how society responded. Instead of questioning the standards that had pushed women toward dangerous treatments, observers quietly blamed the women themselves. They whispered that a lady must have applied the substance improperly or too frequently, suggesting that her suffering was the result of personal excess rather than social expectation. The scars, the swelling, the loss of vision, these became marks of supposed carelessness rather than evidence of a system that demanded unsafe practices. Women carried the burden of their injuries privately, while the ideals that harmed them remained intact. Some tried to conceal the damage with heavier powders and pigments, creating layers thick enough to obscure the worst effects. But these solutions offered only temporary comfort. The skin beneath worsened as it suffocated under each application. Others withdrew from public life, avoiding gatherings where their altered appearance might invite scrutiny. A few sought remedies from apothecaries, though the cures often involved additional harmful substances. In the absence of true medical understanding, attempts to repair the damage sometimes deepened it. Each step women took to escape the consequences bound them more tightly to the cycle of harm. These mistakes, if they could be called that, were less the result of ignorance than of pressure. Every woman understood that beauty required diligence, and in a world where appearance shaped opportunity, the cost of refusing the ritual seemed greater than the cost of participating in it. Their choices were shaped not by freedom, but by expectation. The same expectation that praised their refinement while turning away from the wounds that refinement created. The consequences carved themselves into their faces, marking them long after the fashions that inspired their suffering faded from relevance. Such irreversible harm revealed how beauty could turn against the very women who pursued it with devotion. And as disfigurement spread silently through households and courts, women searched for safer ways to imitate the standards that continued to demand perfection. Among those attempts lay practices that seemed gentler at first glance, yet carried their own complex costs. Among the lower classes, the pursuit of Tudor beauty standards unfolded in conditions far harsher than those faced by noble women. The desire to imitate the refined appearance of the court did not vanish simply because resources were scarce. If anything, the yearning grew sharper. For women who spent their days in markets, fields, or crowded alleys, the sight of noble ladies with pale brows, high foreheads, and polished faces represented a world they could never enter, yet still longed to approach. To look refined promised not only admiration, but a brief escape from the realities that shaped their daily lives. And so, without the tools, powders, or attendants available to wealthier households, they turned to whatever means they could gather. Their tools were crude: small knives used for kitchen work, blades dulled from cutting rope or cloth, shards of metal found in workshops, or even the edges of broken pottery. These implements were never meant for delicate grooming, yet women used them to scrape away the brows, holding their skin taut with one hand while guiding the blade cautiously with the other. The movements were hesitant at first, but necessity forged familiarity. A woman who managed to remove the hairs cleanly felt a quiet triumph, even as the skin beneath grew raw. There was no ointment to soothe the irritation, no powders to hide the redness. The transformation lacked the smoothness seen in court portraits, but it signaled an attempt to climb closer to the ideal. Some relied on charcoal to thin the appearance of the brows before attempting removal. They burned sticks until the wood turned brittle and black, then used the ash to soften the hairs or mask uneven patches. Others applied lime water, made by mixing water with crushed limestone, to weaken the hair follicles. The substance burned fiercely on the skin, leaving a sharp sting that lingered long after the application ended. Women endured the pain, believing it a necessary step toward refinement. In cramped rooms or beside outdoor fires, they repeated these efforts, hoping the results would help them resemble the noble women whose features they admired from a distance. The risks were immense. A slip of the blade could create deep cuts that bled onto their clothing. Lime water sometimes eroded the skin rather than the hair, leaving bright, painful patches that took weeks to heal. Infection followed easily, especially in homes where sanitation was limited. Women worked through sickness, covering their brows with cloth during labor and removing it only when necessary. The hope of appearing elegant, even briefly, gave them reason to continue despite the mounting harm. They accepted the pain because beauty, in their eyes, promised dignity that poverty often denied. What made this pursuit more striking was the social landscape that surrounded it. Women who adopted noble grooming practices attracted attention, sometimes admiration, sometimes ridicule. Neighbors whispered that a woman shaving her brows wished to seem above her station, or that she copied the fashions of ladies she would never meet. Yet others viewed the effort sympathetically, recognizing in it the same longing they carried themselves. The desire to appear refined cut across class boundaries, even if the means to achieve it differed wildly. Some women found themselves caught between wanting to imitate the nobles and fearing the judgment of those who shared their hardship. Still, the imitation spread. Mothers taught their daughters how to thin the brows with charcoal or scrape them clean with a kitchen knife. They demonstrated how to soften the area with warm water before beginning, though it did little to protect the skin. They explained that a wider forehead conveyed intelligence, that looking well kept might influence how others treated them in markets or gatherings. Girls accepted these teachings because they saw the pride in their mothers' faces when the ritual was complete. The pain, for them, became a quiet part of growing up. Some women went further, redrawing delicate brows with soot mixed with a drop of water. The lines were uneven, easily smudged, yet they offered a faint resemblance to the fine arches worn by noble women. In moments of stillness, before work began or after it ended, these women looked into cracked mirrors or polished metal surfaces and adjusted the lines carefully. For a brief moment, they felt aligned with a beauty standard they rarely glimpsed closely. The illusion did not last, worn away by sweat, labor, and weather. But the ritual persisted, renewed each day. The physical costs deepened over time. The brows, once shaved too often, grew back in rough, scattered patches or failed to return entirely. The skin thickened in some places and thinned in others, forming scars that no simple remedy could erase. Women learned to hide these marks beneath headscarves or by avoiding direct light. Their faces bore the history of every attempt to match an ideal shaped far from the worlds they inhabited. Yet these marks did not extinguish their determination. If anything, they hardened their resolve, reminding them of the effort that refinement demanded. Such attempts reveal the extent to which beauty standards influenced not just those in the courts, but those in the poorest homes. The women who labored for survival each day still carved time from their routines to shape their brows, scrape their foreheads, and redraw features erased by harsh tools. Their commitment showed how deeply the desire to be seen as graceful, dignified, or worthy took root in Tudor life, regardless of class. Such painful imitation revealed how deeply even the poorest women longed for a glimpse of the refinement they saw from afar. And as the cost of that longing marked their skin, their methods grew harsher in the hope of achieving cleaner, smoother results. Within those harsher attempts lay truths that exposed just how much suffering the promise of elegance could demand. Eyebrow drawing in Tudor society evolved into something far more deliberate than a simple corrective gesture. Once the natural brows had been removed, women were left with a blank expanse that demanded reinvention. What they created upon that blankness became a quiet expression of identity, constrained by standards, yet shaped by personal instinct. In private chambers lit by candles or daylight slipping through narrow windows, women leaned close to polished metal mirrors and began to redraw what nature had taken away. Each stroke carried intention. Each line represented a choice to reclaim a feature stripped down by ritual. Some women gravitated toward extremely small brows, thin enough to resemble a whisper above the eyes. These lines were drawn lightly with charcoal or with mineral pigments mixed to form a soft paste. Held delicately, the tool traced a shape that hovered almost invisibly across the forehead. The smallness of these brows suggested restraint, modesty, and careful self-control, qualities prized in Tudor femininity. A brow too bold risked implying assertiveness or defiance, traits unwelcome in courtly circles. Women understood this silently, letting the faintness of the line speak for them. Others placed the brows unusually high, far above their natural position. This height was intentional, designed to increase the perceived distance between the eyes and the brow ridge. The effect was immediate. The forehead expanded, the upper face opened, and the overall expression drifted towards something ethereal, almost removed from earthly concerns. In paintings and illuminated manuscripts, saints and angels often appeared with similarly elevated features. Women followed these cues, drawing their brows so high that the space below them became a pale field, interrupted only by the slight movement of the eyelids. This approach exaggerated the ideals of the era, lifting the face into a realm of quiet perfection. The result, however, was an expression that bordered on unreadable, with the brows drawn so thin, so delicate, and placed so far above the eyes. The face lost much of its natural communication. Emotions softened to near stillness, surprise, concern, and amusement. These could no longer be signaled clearly. Women moved through halls, markets, and gatherings with faces that appeared perpetually calm, untouched by the daily fluctuations that animated ordinary features. Observers described this look as graceful or serene. But beneath that calm lay the reality of a face stripped of its instinctive language. For women, maintaining this drawn expression required precision each day. A misplaced line could shift the entire effect, making the forehead appear uneven or the expression unintentionally sharp. Some practiced their strokes repeatedly, testing charcoal on scraps of parchment before approaching their mirrors. They studied portraits for guidance, noting how gentle arches conveyed softness or how subtle curves suggested humility. Though the standards were clear, the execution remained personal. Each brow became a signature, revealing the hand of the woman who crafted it. The tools themselves shaped the outcome. Charcoal offered control, but smudged easily, requiring a steady touch and frequent reapplication. Mineral pigments, once mixed, allowed for sharper definition, though they demanded skill to avoid creating lines that appeared too harsh. Women experimented quietly, not to rebel but to perfect the illusion they were expected to maintain. These small acts of decision-making, angle, thickness, and distance formed the closest thing to artistic freedom many possessed in their grooming rituals. Despite the effort, the results were fragile. Warmth from the hearth softened pigments, causing lines to fade or blur by midday. Sweat from labor, or even from standing in crowded gatherings, dissolved the strokes into faint shadows. Women carried cloths tucked into sleeves to correct these imperfections discreetly. In wealthier households, attendants stepped in to maintain the brows throughout the day, dabbing away moisture or redrawing lines as needed. Those without help relied on glances into reflective surfaces, adjusting their expressions so that the fading lines did not betray them. The emotional impact of these drawn brows was subtle, but profound. Women who had once communicated freely with natural expressions now found themselves relying on posture and tone rather than facial cues. Their faces, controlled and curated, reflected ideals that valued tranquility over spontaneity. Over time, some grew accustomed to seeing themselves this way. Others felt a distance from the person behind the painted surface, as though the face they wore publicly belonged more to society than to themselves. Yet within these restrictions, artistry still emerged. The act of drawing brows offered a moment of quiet agency, a chance to shape the face on one's own terms, even within the confines of expectation. A woman could choose how high to place the arch, how soft to make the curve, how faint or decisive to allow the line to be. Each decision, small as it seemed, revealed a trace of individuality within a system that demanded uniformity. Such delicate lines showed how women rebuilt their faces piece by piece, creating beauty through discipline rather than instinct. And as the painted brows grew higher and thinner, the standards that guided them reached deeper into every corner of the Tudor face. Through those expanding standards emerged pressures that would soon reshape not only features, but the very meaning of social status itself. Portrait artists held a quiet but powerful influence over Tudor beauty ideals, shaping not only how women were seen but how they saw themselves. In workshops filled with the smell of pigments and stretched canvas, these painters refined features with deliberate choices that echoed across households, courts, and generations. Their work did not simply record a face, it perfected it. And through that perfection, they solidified expectations that women then felt compelled to imitate in their daily grooming. What began as an artistic convention gradually hardened into a social truth. When an artist prepared to paint a noble woman, he approached the brows with the same restraint society demanded. The natural shape, whether thick, sparse, crooked, or uneven, held no authority once the sitter took her position. Artists learned quickly that a high, open forehead signaled refinement, so they softened the brow until it appeared as a faint shadow or erased it altogether. Many created brows so thin they resembled threads, positioned high on the forehead and curved delicately upward. These lines became symbols rather than features, suggesting purity, intelligence, and submission to the ideals of the court. The women being painted often accepted these alterations without protest. Some even requested them. To appear in a portrait with natural, expressive brows risked seeming less dignified, less graceful, less aligned with the polished figures displayed in royal galleries. A portrait was more than a likeness. It was a statement of identity, lineage, and virtue. The sitter wanted the world to see her as serene, composed, and worthy of respect. If that required abandoning the face she wore daily, the compromise felt justified. Painters, through their choices, created visual echoes that spread far beyond the individuals they depicted. When a portrait hung in a great hall or a bedchamber, it influenced not only visitors, but the households serving the family. Women of lower rank saw the brows, or lack thereof, on their mistresses and absorbed the message silently. Servants dressing noble women paid close attention to the painted features, adjusting their own grooming habits accordingly. Girls growing up in these households internalized the painted ideals before they ever touched a razor or a pot of pigment. The portrait became a tutor, teaching them which features deserved praise and which needed correction. As painters repeated these conventions across families and generations, the style solidified into expectation. A noble woman with natural brows risked appearing unfashionable or lacking refinement, even if her features were otherwise admired. The portraits created a unified image of beauty that left little room for deviation. Women striving to match what they saw on canvas embraced harsher grooming methods because the painted faces promised elegance that reality rarely granted. When they shaved, plucked, or thinned their brows to resemble the portraits, They were not chasing vanity, they were chasing acceptance. The influence did not stop at the upper class. Reproductions of royal portraits circulated widely through engravings, church decorations, and household items. Even families who never saw a noblewoman in person became familiar with the smooth foreheads and faint brows celebrated in these images. For them, imitating the style carried a different meaning. It suggested aspiration, a desire to align themselves with the cultured and the powerful. Many believed that matching the painted ideal could elevate their social presence. Even if only symbolically, they shaved, scraped, and redrew their brows, not because they lived in courts, but because the imagery surrounding them insisted that beauty required it. The power of these portraits lay not in their accuracy, but in their authority. They presented a version of womanhood untouched by sweat, illness, or hardship. The skin glowed uniformly. The forehead shone pale and unbroken. And the expression remained calm, no matter the sitter's true emotions. Women who gazed upon these canvases saw not themselves but the standards they felt compelled to reach. Each painting reinforced the idea that beauty was not natural but manufactured, something earned through discipline, ritual, and sacrifice. As painters refined their techniques, the distance between painted beauty and lived reality widened. Women trying to replicate the look often discovered that their skin could not replicate the softness of pigment or the gentle highlight created by skilled hands. They shaved deeper, powdered more heavily, and drew thinner brows in response. The portrait had not simply documented them, it had reshaped them. And the face they presented to the world grew increasingly similar to the one crafted by the artist rather than the one given by nature. Even as some women struggled with infections, irritation, or scarring from grooming practices, portraits continued to display unblemished faces. No painter would have included the redness above the brows, the tiny cuts, or the uneven regrowth. These omissions created an illusion of beauty untouched by consequence, reinforcing the belief that the ideal face required no explanation. Women did not see the pain behind the canvas. They saw only the result they were expected to match. Such selective portrayals revealed how artists quietly dictated the standards women were asked to embody. And as those painted ideals spread through households and villages, the pressure to erase natural features grew heavier with each admiring glance. From that growing pressure emerged choices that would deepen the divide between the faces women had and the faces society demanded. A high forehead in Tudor society carried a meaning that extended far beyond appearance. It acted as a silent declaration of status, education, and cultivated refinement, qualities that only certain layers of society were permitted to display without question. To look upon a woman with a broad, balleux, carefully groomed forehead was to assume things about her upbringing, her discipline, and the household that shaped her. The face itself became a kind of credential, suggesting that the woman behind it lived a life structured by learning, propriety, and access to comforts unavailable to most. Beauty was intertwined with social standing until the two were nearly indistinguishable. Among the nobility, grooming the forehead and brows was woven naturally into the rhythm of daily life. Noble women had attendants who prepared their tools, mixed their powders, and maintained the smoothness of their foreheads each morning. They possessed the rare luxury of time, the time to sit before a mirror, the time to correct imperfections, the time to reshape and repaint until every detail aligned with the ideal. Their days included long intervals devoted to presentation, as if the face they showed the world were just as important as the duties they performed. In this environment, a high forehead became an emblem of cultivated living, something that could flourish only where labor was delegated and leisure existed. Education further reinforced the association. A broad forehead had long been linked to intelligence in European tradition, shaped by medieval scholarship and physiognomy. Writers, clerics, and later humanists argued quietly or explicitly, that a spacious brow indicated a mind capable of elevated thought. When such ideas mingled with courtly fashion, the effect was powerful. A noble woman, with a widened forehead, seemed to embody both learning and virtue, even if her daily life allowed little actual education. The illusion mattered more than the truth. Society looked upon her and saw not the hours of shaving or the layers of powder, but the mark of intellect. Beauty and presumed wisdom merged into a single, carefully curated image. For women outside the noble ranks, the meaning of a high forehead was more complicated, yet no less significant. Tudor society drew rigid boundaries between classes, and appearance became one of the most immediate ways to enforce those boundaries. A working woman who displayed natural brows or a low hairline risked appearing unrefined, even if she possessed intelligence or dignity equal to those above her. She moved through markets, workshops, or village gatherings, aware that her face identified her place before she spoke a single word. The brows she kept, or removed, acted almost like a badge, silently announcing her distance from courtly ideals. Because of this, many common women attempted to adopt the same grooming rituals practiced by the elite, even without the tools or time that nobles enjoyed. Shaving the brows or scraping the hairline became a means to blur the distinction between classes, to enter social spaces with a hint of refinement otherwise denied to them. In their minds, altering the forehead was not only an act of beauty, but a form of aspiration. A woman who widened her forehead could present herself as more educated, more disciplined, more respectable than her circumstances might otherwise allow. The transformation, however imperfect, offered a brief sense of upward movement in a society that rarely permitted such shifts. These efforts carried risks beyond the physical. A common woman who altered her appearance too obviously might invite whispering from neighbors who believed she aimed above her station. Some accused such women of vanity, others of deceit. Yet the pressure to maintain dignity pushed many forward regardless. They shaved early in the morning, often before their work began, hoping the smoothness of the forehead would hold long enough to influence how they were greeted, evaluated, or spoken to. Their faces became tools of survival, instruments for negotiating respect in a world that offered little. Still, even as common women worked to imitate elite grooming, the differences in outcome revealed the distance between classes. Without fine razors, their shaved foreheads carried small cuts and rough patches. Without soft powders, the rawness of the skin remained visible. Without attendants, the ritual consumed precious moments carved out of labor-filled days. Yet their determination persisted, because the meaning of the forehead had expanded far beyond beauty. It had become a symbol of social aspiration, a quiet protest against the rigid hierarchy that governed their lives. The nobles, in turn, reinforced these distinctions by perfecting the ideal even further. Their portraits displayed foreheads so pale and expansive that they seemed to hover above the rest of the face. Their brows appeared as delicate threads drawn by steady hands. Their grooming, supported by wealth and leisure, created results that common women could imitate but never fully match. The ideal remained just out of reach, preserving the visual language that separated the privileged from the poor. In this way, the forehead evolved into a marker of identity. To widen it was to announce, silently, one's alignment with values deemed superior. To leave it natural was to accept the status assigned by birth. Women learned to negotiate these meanings with each stroke of a razor or line of pigment. Their reflections carried not only their features, but their hopes, their fears, and their place in the structure of Tudor society. Such distinctions revealed how the forehead became a surface where social hierarchy wrote itself plainly onto the body. And as women of every rank struggled to meet, or imitate, the ideal, the pressure to perfect the upper face only grew more demanding. Through that rising pressure emerged judgments that extended far beyond beauty. shaping how women were valued in every corner of their world. The expectations surrounding the Tudor forehead did not fade with time. They settled into households and families until they became traditions passed from mother to daughter as naturally as lessons in sewing or prayer. What began as a courtly ideal transformed into a rhythm of daily life, shaping the way generations of women understood beauty, dignity, and their place in the world. Each girl inherited not only the tools used to widen the forehead or erase the brows, but the quiet insistence that failing to do so marked her as careless, unschooled, or unworthy of admiration. The rituals that governed the upper face became heirlooms, painful, demanding, and deeply rooted. A young girl's introduction to these practices often began earlier than her understanding. She watched her mother scrape, pluck, or powder without question, absorbing each movement as part of what it meant to become a woman. When her own brows began to darken in adolescence, the household did not wait. Mothers gently guided her to the mirror, explaining that leaving the brows untouched would make her appear unsophisticated or unfinished. In some homes, the warning was direct. A girl with natural brows risked being judged as lacking discipline, or worse, lacking prospects. The pressure to avoid seeming rural, backward, or unprepared settled on her shoulders long before she understood its full weight. The grooming methods themselves were passed down with equal care. Mothers taught daughters how to angle a knife, so it grazed the flesh without cutting too deeply. How to pluck hairs from the root to delay regrowth. How to press powder into the tender skin so the redness did not show beneath candlelight. They shared small tricks to disguise mistakes, warming the powder between fingers to soften its texture, smudging charcoal lightly to create a faint arc instead of a stark line, mixing chalk with vinegar to brighten the forehead before painting brows into place. These tips traveled silently from one generation to the next, linking women across decades in a chain of techniques born from expectation. Each generation refined the ritual, not because beauty demanded innovation, but because the pressure to meet the ideal grew steadily sharper. A girl who failed to groom her forehead properly risked ridicule from peers or admonishment from elders. The standards were so deeply internalized that many no longer questioned their origins. To appear in public with natural brows was to invite whispers, to appear unfinished or uncultured. Some communities believed that a girl unwilling to maintain her forehead properly revealed flaws in her upbringing. Others insisted she would struggle to secure a respectable marriage, as though the arc of a brow reflected the arc of her character. Marriage prospects became one of the strongest forces sustaining this ritual. Families judged daughters partially through their presentation, and a high, open forehead symbolized discipline, modesty, and willingness to conform, all qualities that Tudor society valued in wives. Mothers reminded daughters gently, then firmly, that a woman with unruly brows might be overlooked in favor of one whose face reflected refinement. These warnings were rarely spoken with cruelty. They were offered with the heavy tenderness of women who had lived through such judgments themselves. Mothers believed they were preparing their daughters for survival, not imposing burdens that could have been resisted. Over time, the ritual shaped identity as much as appearance. Girls learned to evaluate their reflections not by instinct, but by comparison to portraits, neighbors, and family lineage. Their brows became markers of belonging, proof that they understood and respected the rules passed to them. To neglect grooming was to reject the legacy of the women who had shaped them. The forehead became a surface upon which loyalty, discipline, and aspiration were written daily. Some embraced the ritual with pride, feeling connected to their mothers and grandmothers through each careful stroke. Others accepted it with resignation, knowing that deviation carried consequences. What makes this generational transmission more striking is how little space existed for alternative understandings of beauty. The ideal had become so thoroughly embedded in the culture that even women who suffered painful reactions or disfigurement from grooming rarely questioned the practice itself. They taught their daughters the same methods they had used, believing the ritual essential despite the harm it caused. Their memories of swollen skin, irritated brows, or lingering scars faded behind the stronger memory of social expectations. Endurance became part of femininity, and sacrifice became inseparable from beauty. The continuity of these practices created a world in which a woman's face, particularly her forehead, was never entirely her own. It belonged partly to tradition, partly to family, and partly to the judgments that shaped public life. A daughter might inherit her mother's tools, her grandmother's techniques, and her great-grandmother's warnings, carrying them forward without realizing that the rituals she performed were born from constraints rather than choice. The ideal had become self-sustaining, reinforced from within the family, even when the court that inspired it had moved on. Such persistent rituals revealed how beauty ideals embedded themselves so deeply that they outlived the era that created them. And as each generation repeated the practices of the last, the pressure to conform tightened quietly around every young woman's face. Through that tightening emerged new expectations that would test how far families were willing to go to preserve the illusion of refinement. The absence of eyebrows in Tudor society was not merely a matter of beauty, it was a form of control. An unspoken rule that dictated who was allowed to present themselves naturally and who was expected to conform to standards shaped by hierarchy, piety, and power. While many women shaved or plucked their brows out of personal desire or social pressure, others did so because their positions demanded it. Their faces became symbols of obedience, shaped not by choice, but by the expectations attached to their roles. In these cases, the removal of the brows carried meanings that reached beyond appearance, touching questions of devotion, loyalty, and submission. For women who entered religious life, the decision was rarely theirs. Some orders encouraged or required the removal of eyebrows as a physical declaration of rejecting worldly vanity. The act, performed quietly in the dim light of convent chambers, was meant to symbolize spiritual rebirth, a step toward humility and detachment from earthly concerns. Without brows, the face mirrored the pale, serene expressions seen in depictions of saints and angels. Yet beneath this symbolism lay an unsettling truth. Even in spaces shaped by faith, women's bodies were altered to reflect ideals determined by others. Their foreheads widened not for beauty but for piety, and the smoothness of their faces became a measure of devotion, judged silently by those around them. In the royal court, the rules grew even stricter. Women who served the queen or moved within her household were expected to maintain brows that aligned with the monarch's own grooming practices. If the queen kept her brows faint or nearly absent, no lady of her circle dared to appear with anything more pronounced. A brow too dark or too full risked implying comparison. Or worse, competition. The court was a place where every gesture, every thread of clothing, every shift of expression carried political meaning. A woman whose brows appeared thicker than the queen's might attract whispers accusing her of presumption or disrespect. In such a setting, grooming became a silent performance of loyalty, each stroke of the razor reinforcing one's place in the hierarchy. For some women, allowing their brows to grow back was interpreted as defiance. Grooming rituals that had become routine were not easily abandoned, even when personal preference shifted. A woman who hesitated to shave her brows, or whose regrowth became visible, might find herself the subject of scrutiny. Neighbors questioned her discipline. Servants speculated about her intentions, and peers wondered whether she wished to distinguish herself in ways that breached custom. In households shaped by strict adherence to Tudor ideals, a returning brow was not merely unattractive, it was disobedient. It suggested a withdrawal from the expectations that bound women together, a quiet refusal to participate in the unspoken agreement that beauty required conformity. This pressure did not discriminate. Noble women, merchants' wives, and village girls alike learned that brows could carry meaning far beyond their physical presence. A smooth forehead signaled alignment with social expectations. A growing or darkening brow hinted at resistance. Women adjusted their grooming habits carefully, not only to fit beauty ideals, but to avoid provoking social suspicion. The cost of misinterpretation could be high, reputation diminished, relationships strained, and opportunities lost. In a world where appearances shaped destiny, even a single line of hair could disrupt one's standing. Within families, these rules created tension that echoed through generations. Mothers corrected daughters who allowed their brows to return, reminding them of the consequences of appearing careless or rebellious. Sisters monitored one another quietly, ensuring no one risked disrupting the image of refinement the household maintained. These gestures were not born of malice, but of fear. Fear that deviation would cast doubt upon the entire family's discipline. The removal of brows became an inheritance not easily relinquished. The idea that a woman might choose to keep her natural features felt, to some, like an affront to the sacrifices of the women who came before her. Yet beneath these expectations lay a quieter, more painful reality. Many women longed for the freedom to let their brows grow naturally. They touched the faint stubble in the privacy of their chambers, wishing they could keep what their faces once held. But the weight of expectation pressed against them, reminding them that choices carried consequences far beyond their reflections. Their faces were not solely theirs, they belonged to the society that watched them, the families that shaped them, and the roles they inhabited. In this world, the eyebrow was no longer a simple feature. It became a boundary between obedience and suspicion, devotion and vanity, belonging and rebellion. Women learned to navigate this boundary with care, shaping their brows or erasing them, to preserve safety as much as beauty. The absence of hair above the eyes became a sign of discipline that few dared to question, and the presence of hair became a whisper of challenges that society refused to tolerate. Such rigid expectations revealed how even the smallest features could be transformed into symbols of loyalty and restraint. And as women struggled to balance obedience with the quiet desire to reclaim their own faces, the strain deepened across households and generations. Out of that deepening strain rose faint gestures of defiance that suggested change might be forming in silence. Resistance in Tudor society rarely took the shape of bold declarations. For women whose lives were shaped by expectation, obedience, and scrutiny, defiance had to settle into quieter spaces. Small choices made behind closed doors, gestures subtle enough to escape punishment, yet meaningful enough to reclaim a fragment of the self. These acts did not overturn the ideals governing the Tudor face, but they revealed the tension between what society demanded and what women wished to preserve. In the stillness of their private chambers, they tested the boundaries of conformity, shaping not only their appearance, but their sense of autonomy. One of the gentlest forms of resistance emerged in the decision to let the brows grow back slightly, allowing a faint trace of hair to settle above the eyes. Women who attempted this rarely allowed the brows to return fully. Such a change would have drawn immediate notice. Instead, they permitted a soft shadow of regrowth, barely visible to others but unmistakable to themselves. Each morning, they passed their fingers lightly over the delicate stubble, feeling the difference between what society expected and what their bodies naturally produced. The sensation carried a quiet comfort, a reminder that their faces still belonged to them, at least in some small measure, because regrowth risked suspicion. Many women paired this choice with careful grooming. They shaped the returning hairs into thin lines rather than removing them entirely, or plucked only the central portion to maintain the illusion of a widened forehead. These adjustments allowed them to present a face that appeared compliant while still preserving something untouched by ritual. The regrowth, however subtle, symbolized a wish to reconnect with the natural expression that had been erased through decades of grooming practices. It was not a rebellion in the dramatic sense, but it was a step toward reclaiming identity. Another form of resistance occurred in moments of privacy, when women painted their brows more boldly than society allowed. Behind shuttered windows or in dimly lit rooms, they traced thicker lines with charcoal or mineral pigments. Experimenting with shapes forbidden in public, some drew their brows closer to their eyes, restoring the natural proportions they remembered from childhood. Others emphasized curves or angles that would have been deemed too expressive, allowing themselves a glimpse of an appearance free from the constraints of refinement. Once the moment passed, they wiped the lines away with a cloth, returning their brows to the faint, obedient strokes expected of them. These temporary transformations were fleeting but powerful, offering a glimpse of agency before the demands of daily life resumed. Hair also became a tool of quiet dissent. Women who felt unable to alter their brows directly began using their hair to conceal the upper face. They experimented with longer fringes, letting soft strands fall across the forehead to obscure the hairline and brow ridge. This style, though subtle, signaled a choice to veil the area society scrutinized most intensely. A lowered strand or a shifted part could hide redness, uneven regrowth, or simply the desire for privacy. The gesture might appear trivial to observers, yet each woman knew the intention behind it. By allowing their hair to fall where society expected openness, they created a small barrier between themselves and the standards that shaped their reflections. Such quiet acts gained meaning not through visibility, but through persistence. Women repeated them day after day, weaving them into their routines until they became habits rather than exceptions. These gestures existed in a delicate balance, always close to discovery, yet protected by subtlety. They revealed a truth often overlooked. While Tudor beauty norms exerted tremendous pressure, they did not extinguish the desire for self-determination. Even the smallest deviation carried a sense of reclamation. A slightly darker brow, a hidden forehead, a moment of boldness in solitude. Each allowed women to preserve a fragment of individuality in a world that demanded uniformity. These acts of resistance also traveled quietly through families. Mothers sometimes allowed their daughters a bit more freedom in grooming, shaping, but not erasing the brows, or teaching them how to place hair in ways that softened the severity of the forehead. These teachings were never spoken openly. They lived in gestures, in shared looks, in moments of encouragement too subtle to record. The privacy of these choices reinforced their power. Women passed along not only the rituals of conformity, but the strategies of quiet defiance, giving the next generation tools to navigate beauty standards with a touch more autonomy. The persistence of these hidden acts revealed an important shift. Even as society continued to reward the high forehead and faint brows, women began testing the limits of what they could alter without breaking the rules entirely. They did not deny beauty standards outright, but they nudged against them, opening space for self-expression within the narrow margins permitted. The resistance grew not through collective rebellion, but through individual decisions repeated in silence. Such small gestures revealed how even tightly controlled beauty ideals could not completely suppress a woman's instinct to reclaim her own face. And as these quiet choices gathered strength, they signaled a subtle loosening of the standards that had governed the Tudor forehead for generations. Across that quiet loosening appeared signs of a deeper shift forming beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to be seen. She moved through each day beneath a silence shaped not by her own wishes but by the expectations that pressed against every inch of her face. There was something strangely still about the way Tudor women carried themselves, as if the features they presented to the world had been trained to obey before they ever learned to speak. A forehead widened by removal, brows thinned to nothing, cheeks covered in the pale dust of powders that hid what lay underneath. Each part was a reminder that beauty here was not something discovered, but something imposed. It was a landscape built from rules rather than desire, a place where the natural lines of a woman's face no longer belonged to her. She woke to the routine without question, because questioning had no place in the rhythm handed down through her household. The basin of cold water, the cloth that smelled faintly of vinegar, the small blade resting near the mirror. All of it waited for her before the morning meal. Her attendants stood nearby, their own faces reflecting the same vacancy. The same smooth absence of hair that had been shaped by years of instruction. They did not ask whether she wanted these changes. They only asked whether she wished for the lines to be cleaner, the skin to appear smoother, the brow to look more proper under candlelight. When she leaned toward the glass, the surface returned a face that no longer felt familiar. It was still hers, yet it belonged more to the demands of the court than to the quiet thoughts moving behind her eyes. The brows that once softened her expression were gone, replaced by faint shadows drawn in the thinnest strokes. The hair at her forehead had receded further than she remembered, authorizing, creating an expanse of pale skin that looked almost detached from the rest of her. It was not disfigurement. It was expectation, carved into flesh so gradually that resistance felt almost impossible. Around her, other women moved with the same muted acceptance. Their beauty had been standardized, harmonized into a single image that left little room for individuality. Faces became statements of obedience, as if each woman announced her loyalty through the careful removal of anything that hinted at natural growth. The court admired uniformity. It praised the illusion of purity, intelligence, and control. Yet beneath the powder lay the remnants of a face shaped by birth rather than by the demands of the palace. And these remnants were treated as imperfections to be erased. To keep up meant more than simple grooming. It meant surrender. The rituals took time, sometimes hours, but time itself was part of the performance. Only women with status could afford such meticulous shaping, reinforcing the belief that refinement was a privilege and that natural features suggested a lack of discipline. Those who failed to maintain this appearance were met with whispers, judgment, or polite dissent. Those who excelled were praised not for who they were, but for how effectively they had removed traces of their own nature. Some nights, she touched the bare skin above her eyes and wondered how much of herself had been taken without open conflict. The loss did not feel sudden. It was steady, quiet, disguised as grooming, care, preparation. But behind that quietness was a truth she could feel. Her face no longer belonged entirely to her. It belonged to the eyes that watched, to the paintings that set the standard, to the demands that shaped every impression she made. She was expected to protect this artificial surface as if it were her duty, and any deviation from it felt like a breach, a risk no woman wished to take, even in private moments. The pressure lingered. She rarely allowed her reflection to rest without corrections. A stray hair, a darkening shadow, an uneven line. They all suggested carelessness, and carelessness threatened standing. What began as a beauty ideal had become an obligation, a quiet law enforced through tradition rather than command. The result was a life spent polishing, removing, and adjusting a face that the world insisted she must present. Beauty had turned into a burden heavy enough to reshape identity. And yet, beneath the powder and the careful strokes, a memory persisted of what her face had once looked like. Untouched, it existed only in fragments. An angle, a softness, a line that no longer appeared. That memory travelled with her, even as she conformed, even as she bowed her head beneath the expectations placed upon it. It was a reminder that somewhere behind the rules and rituals, there had once been a version of her who chose rather than complied. Such relentless shaping showed how beauty could become a discipline rather than an expression. And as the weight of these expectations settled deeper into daily life, the sense of ownership over one's face slipped further from reach. Just beyond that slipping sense lingered a question of what women would claim back when the chance finally arrived. Across the centuries, the remnants of Tudor beauty ideals continued to linger, settling into daily life with a familiarity so quiet that few ever questioned where those habits began. The world no longer resembled the courts of England. Yet the old belief that a high, open forehead signaled intelligence still drifted through conversations, au portrait, and private rituals. Mothers repeated it to their daughters without considering its origins. Artists echoed it in the way they shaped faces. Entire generations absorbed it without noticing the long chain of inherited gestures behind every small adjustment to the brow or forehead. Modern routines rarely acknowledged the past, but the influence remained persistent. Eyebrows were plucked, trimmed, reshaped, or softened with powders, all in pursuit of a cleaner, more elevated look. No one thought of Tudor razors scraping hairline after hairline, or the white lead powders covering raw skin beneath layers of paint-like cosmetics. Yet those ancient methods had carved out a pattern of expectation that continued to steer beauty practices long after the original pain had been forgotten. Families carried these ideals forward in subtle ways. A grandmother's comment about refinement, a mother's insistence on grooming before guests arrived, a quiet preference for smoothness over natural texture. All of it reflected beliefs, formed in courts where beauty was law and deviation a mark of inferiority. The language had changed, but the underlying message remained steady. The forehead must look calm, open, thoughtful. The brows must behave. Daily life absorbed these ideas so thoroughly that they appeared self-evident. Cosmetics brands offered tools designed to lift the brow or brighten the forehead. Tutorials taught ways to create a greater sense of space between the eye and hairline. Fashion photography favored faces, stripped of unruly lines or shadows. The high forehead ideal was no longer associated with queens, but it continued to shape expectations of professionalism, elegance, and intelligence. Yet the strange part was how lightly all of this rested upon memory. Few remembered that the Tudor ideal forehead had been artificially created through hair removal, rather than admired as a natural gift. Few remembered the infections, the scarring, the discomfort, or the constant maintenance required just to avoid appearing unfinished. Instead, the remnants of the ideal lived on in softened, almost invisible forms, like traces of an old script rewritten again and again until only the outline remained. People still felt its pressure, even without knowing its source. Some individuals plucked their brows reluctantly, bothered by the obligation but unsure how to escape it. Others shaped their faces with confidence, seeing the ritual as a moment of self-possession rather than inherited conformity. And many simply performed the task without thinking, repeating what had been demonstrated to them since childhood. The persistence of these customs revealed how deeply beauty ideals embed themselves into cultural identity. What began as a courtly demand had become a shared habit, reinforced by portraits, stories, and whispered advice. The once rigid rules of elite circles flowed into every level of society, turning personal grooming into a quiet echo of a world long gone. Even when questioned, the ideal resisted disappearance. Critics of beauty standards often focused on broader issues, such as makeup, body expectations, and aging. But the forehead and brow remained strangely untouched, tucked into the realm of small details that no one believed worth challenging. And so the old belief endured, disguised as preference, preserved through routine. In private, some individuals experimented with different looks, letting brows grow fuller or reshaping them away from the classic arc associated with refinement. These acts, though minor, carried a quiet defiance. They pushed against a lineage of expectations that had lasted over 500 years. But even here, the weight of inherited ideals hovered. A single raised eyebrow could invite judgment. A natural brow line could still be labelled messy, and the decision to leave the face untouched required an unusual degree of confidence. Looking at history, it became clear that the past had never left. It waited in mirrors, in gestures of grooming, In fleeting comments about tidiness or structure, the tools no longer drew blood, the powders no longer poisoned. Yet the impulse to correct the face, to refine it in ways that aligned with ancient standards, remained remarkably intact. This was the truest legacy of Tudor beauty culture, not the razors, not the white lead, not the rituals of courtly preservation, but the belief that the face must be shaped rather than accepted, the belief that refinement required alteration, the belief that natural features needed editing before they could be considered worthy. Such enduring impulses revealed how thoroughly the past had woven itself into modern life. And as the echoes of old ideals persisted, the question of what remains unchallenged grew harder to ignore. Along the blurred edge between inheritance and choice lay a final, unsettling truth about what beauty demands. There comes a moment at the end of any long examination of Tudor beauty culture when the rituals, demand, and expectations all collapse into one question that should have been asked from the beginning, yet remained unspoken because no woman of that world was permitted to ask it. The mirrors of Tudor households reflected faces shaped by compliance, not personal desire. And behind those silent surfaces lived countless small sacrifices, each one accepted without protest, because there seemed to be no alternative. Eyebrows, once natural markers of expression, had become symbols of obedience, and the removal of them marked a slow surrender that few paused to consider. Yet if one were to stand in a dim Tudor chamber late at night, watching a woman remove the last traces of powder from her face, one could sense the quiet uncertainty that hovered beneath her still expression. Many women believed they were doing what was necessary to be admired, respected, or simply tolerated. The expectation to widen the forehead, thin the brows, and smooth the features was not framed as a choice, but as a responsibility. They were told that a disciplined woman should keep her face free of anything coarse, uncontrolled, or suggestive of instinct. Beauty was not personal. It was a duty toward one's family, one's husband, and one's social standing. In that system, the loss of eyebrows was presented as a small price to pay for acceptance. Yet the truth was more complex, and the cost far heavier than most realized. Behind the powders and razors lay a deeper tension: to be loved. Did a woman have to lose the very features that once defined her? Tudor culture prized the appearance of refinement so intensely that natural expression was treated as a flaw, without brows to lift or furrow. Women's faces grew quieter, more unreadable, more distant from their own emotions. The court celebrated this stillness as elegance. But beneath the powder, behind the smoothness, lived a person whose reactions could no longer unfold freely. Her face no longer belonged entirely to her. The constant removal of hair brought pain that became part of daily life. Razors scraped away fine hairs, and often layers of skin with them. Tweezers pinched again and again until small drops of blood appeared along the brow bone. Hot wax left swelling that took hours, sometimes days, to fade. These injuries were not treated as harms. They were treated as signs of commitment. A woman who complained risked being labelled weak or undisciplined. So she learned to keep still, to breathe carefully, to endure. These small wounds carried long-term consequences. Infection was common, especially in rooms where mirrors shared space with damp linens, coal dust, and unclean hands. Scars formed beneath layers of white lead and vinegar-based cosmetics. The natural line of the brow disappeared completely, replaced by faint smudges of coal or charcoal drawn high above the eyelid. Over time, the expressions that once came effortlessly, surprise, amusement, disbelief, were muted into one uniform surface. The loss of eyebrows became the loss of emotional clarity, a quiet dimming of individual presence. What, then, that was gained through all of this? Tudor society believed that a woman's worth grew in proportion to her ability to embody the ideal, and the ideal demanded surrender. A woman who shaped herself to match portraits and courtly expectations was considered dignified, intelligent, and morally sound. The more she removed, the more she was praised. Her natural features became proof of imperfection. Her altered features became proof of virtue. Yet this praise carried its own form of confinement, binding women to a standard that required them to erase themselves to be valued. The question of whether eyebrows were worth the trade is not simply historical. It lingers because it reflects the broader question of how much any society demands people change to be accepted. Tudor women shaved, plucked, and powdered because they were told that beauty required it. Many did not realize how deeply these practices shaped their lives until they looked into their own reflections and found someone almost unfamiliar. Their faces belonged less to themselves and more to a system that judged them before they ever spoke. For the daughters who grew up watching their mothers perform these rituals, the idea of choice faded even further. They learned the techniques early: the angle of the razor, the tightness of the skin, the silence required to endure the pain. They absorbed the rules before they understood the reasons. And when they became adults, they continued the practice because they believed it was the only way to be accepted. Thus, the cycle repeated, passing from one generation to the next, turning a temporary fashion into a legacy of quiet suffering. History often records the grand movements, divorce, treaties, and religious shifts, but it rarely records the small, private sacrifices that shape daily life. Eyebrow removal did not change the course of nations, yet it shaped the identity of countless women who lived under Tudor rule. Their faces, shaped by expectation, stood as a quiet testament to the power of cultural pressure. Beneath every widened forehead and every erased brow lay the same unasked question: was beauty worth this? As the Tudor era faded, new standards emerged, new powders were mixed, and new expectations took root. Yet the pattern remained familiar. The tools changed, but the impulse to adjust one's natural features for approval did not disappear. Looking back, it becomes difficult not to wonder how many women across different centuries found themselves facing the same unspoken dilemma: to be loved. Must something essential be removed? Eyebrows are small, yet the act of shaving them represented something far larger. It revealed how deeply a society could shape private identity, how easily pain could be normalized, how quietly a person could lose ownership of their own face. And in that quiet loss, the most unsettling question of all remained: did gaining approval mean losing oneself? Such reflections settle over the Tudor story like a final stillness, revealing how easily beauty can eclipse identity when expectations grow louder than personal truth. And as this long history closes, a faint uncertainty lingers, casting a soft shadow across the faces shaped by centuries of pressure. Across that shadow waits one last quiet inquiry, steady and unresolved, asking whether the cost of beauty has ever truly belonged to those who paid it. Thank you for staying with this long, quiet journey into the hidden corners of Tudor beauty. May your night feel calm. May the darkness around you soften any lingering thoughts, and may rest find you gently. If the world felt heavy today, I hope sleep lightens it. If your mind is crowded, I hope silence settles it. And if you carry worries of your own appearance, may they loosen their grip as you drift into sleep. Good night.